Dr. Locke, if you want to jump in and get us started on some discussion of how to stretch forage resources, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well and staying healthy. I want to thank Barry for asking me to do this. So I'm going to jump in. I know Barry has a very interesting topic to follow up on this. So I'm going to give a little bit of data here on feeding strategies to stretch forage resources. And really what I'm going to show you is one study here. One study here where my master's student here, Ariana Negrero, did for her master's work end of last year, early this year, looking at the effects of a low forage diet on the yields of milk and milk components of mid-lactation dairy cows. And as I'll show in a while, I need to acknowledge the Michigan Alliance for Animal Agriculture for supporting this study. And also Ariana Negrero is supported by a fellowship through VitaPlus Corporation. So why were we interested in this? It was really driven this last 12 months by the forage growing conditions the last year. I just pulled a couple recent articles here about challenges we may have with the 2019 forages, one from John Gazer from Rock River earlier last year, and then at the end of last year, Bill Weiss talking about surviving 2019 forages, some of the challenges with winter kill of alfalfa, and then the delayed harvest and planting and harvest of many forages, including our corn silages. So it kind of prompted us to do this study in this way. Here's some data that John Gazer shared with me a couple days ago, just on comparing October 2017 to October 2019 on the percent precipitation and how much wetter last year's growing conditions were in much of the Midwest of the US. So there's a bit of background here with changes in the availability of our forages potentially this year, specifically due to the unusual cropping seasons or specific locations. I think it's important to explore alternative feed, particularly fiber sources, and I know Barry will talk more about that later as well. You know, clearly work of Mike Allen and many others done a lot of work in the area of sufficient NDF required for dairy cows, particularly forage NDF, to allow for maximal milk yield and while maintaining rumen function. And then in studies that have looked at non-forage fiber sources, there have been some variable responses in terms of milk and protein, milk fat and milk protein yields. And a lot of this may also then depend on what sources that are being fed, the amount and type of starch and fatty acid supplementation and protein supplementation. So there's a wide variability around that. Now, I mentioned the Michigan Alliance for Animal Agriculture. That's been around for 5 years now, and it's been a huge benefit, I think, to our industry and to applied research. It's allowed many people at MSU to do research beyond the more basic things and start to answer questions specifically available right now. And I had this one last year that was titled Increasing the Use of Non-Forage Fiber Sources to Improve Milk Production and Feed Efficiency. And our initial intent of that study was to specifically focus on non-forage fiber sources or byproduct feeds that we could feed to dairy cows. However, with the forage growing conditions and the concerns with forage inventory, forage quality last year, we kind of did a slight switch on that study and really focused it on how feeding a very low forage diet and then coming back in with some of those non-forage fiber sources is maybe as a way to stretch inventory during these periods and do a study to see how low could we go, and if we did that, could we maintain high yields of milk and milk components in some very high producing dairy cows. I think, as we all know, dairy producers are paid for the yields of milk and milk fat in most federal orders now. And clearly anything we do to maybe improve the yields of milk components should hopefully improve cow efficiency and cow profitability. As Barry said earlier, most of my research has focused on lipid metabolism, particularly fatty acid supplementation the last few years. And these are included typically for increasing energy density of the ration. And as we and others have showed the last few years, the responses really do depend on which fatty acids are supplemented. we started to get more interested as well now in amino acid supplementation, particularly how it may interact with fatty acid supplementation. You know, obviously a lot of interest, but primarily in methionine and lysine as potentially most limiting amino acids. There's lots of different ideas around that, lots of different philosophies on feeding those right now. But maybe potentially by supplementing some of these, we can meet requirements without oversupplying crude protein. So in this specific study, our objective was to determine the effects of feeding a low forage diet on the yields of milk and milk components. And our hypothesis was that we could feed a low forage diet containing similar levels of starch, NDF, and rumen degradable protein levels compared to, as I'll show you in a minute, what I would think of as a typical Midwestern diet. And then when we come in with that low forage diet, we were looking at maybe supplementing some palmitic acid and amino acid balancing. And by doing that, we would help maintain yields in milk and milk components. So I'm going to sort of spend some time looking at how we formulated the diets here and then come into the results. For this study, and the study I think ran from December last year through February this year, we had 36 cows. You can see they're all very high producing, about 110, 120 pounds milk, mid-lactation. And we had two treatments. We called a high forage. It could be we could also have called it control, or maybe our typical Midwestern diet for mid-lactation cows. And then what we called our low forage diet. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to call them high forage, low forage. With 2 periods, we had a 4-week feeding period for each, so we had plenty of time for allowing these cows to adapt to these diets to observe changes in milk production as well. So simply, the study was we did milk sampling 2 days every week. We then did body weights 3 days every week, so we could start to look at nutrient partitioning in these cows. Our major data that this data I'm really going to show you today is the data we collected the last 5 days of each sampling period, where we collected milk samples daily, feed ingredients, and orts were collected daily for digestibility. Blood was collected every 15 hours as well, to get a real detailed look at nutrient digestibility, metabolism, milk production. Just going to show the milk production data now because we haven't finished some of that other lab work at this time. So remember what I said earlier on, we're calling this high forage is really our controlled or a fairly typical Midwestern diet. When Ariana and I were putting these diets together, I really need to acknowledge the roles that Stacey Nichols at VitaPlus and Nate Elsing at Caledonia helped us in sort of getting these diets into sort of the commercial realm of what would be typically fed. So this high forage diet was very similar to our conventional high group cow diet on our farm. And then with our collaborations, we really sort of tried to push this low forage diet to see how low we could go while still making it sort of commercially applicable. So I think both of these diets have a lot of applicability in the industry. So what you can see here, primarily here, is that we were able to drop the amount of forage in the diet across corn and alfalfa silages and our dry hay. And on a formulated basis, our high forage diet compared to our low forage diet, we're almost halving the amount of forage that was being fed on a dry matter basis to these cows. And that was by dropping both corn silage and alfalfa silage here. You can see we switched the grain sources here. We had a mostly high moisture corn in this high group here on our control diet. We took out all of that high moisture corn and replaced it with dry corn in the low forage diet. Obviously, with the lower amount of forage NDF in this diet, we were concerned about rumen pH and the like. So we reduced the fermentability of the grain that was being fed. And then you can see we increased a range of different byproducts here: beet pulp, corn gluten meal, soy hulls, cottonseed, all increased in these diets. And actually soybean meal dropped somewhat as well. And that's because we had 2 different high group packs here. We had our control pack, and then we had our low forage pack here that contained some blood meal and some supplemental amino acids. And that's why the soybean meal level was down somewhat. And you can see here, we also added a palmitic acid enriched supplement to help increase energy density of the diet and help supply some more fatty acids in that diet as well. So I think the thing to remember here, this isn't really one of those studies where we're looking at changing one single ingredient or one single nutrient. It's really a proof of concept study that we could, if necessary, or if someone wanted, we could really reduce forage going into these diets and stretch inventory as needed, or maybe even just allowing you to feed lower forage diets if, you know, land-based was an issue, and some of those things and the like. On a formulated basis, as you'd imagine, with some of the ingredients I said we included in that low forage diet, on a predicted intake, the low forage diet would have cost more overall, and on a cost per pound of dry matter as well. So let's keep that in mind as we go through here as well. On a nutrient content basis here, the low forage diet was obviously somewhat drier. Our goal here was to balance these diets, and I was really pleased how this came out. We balanced the diets for total NDF. Now remember, a lot more of this NDF here is coming from non-forage fiber sources, okay? But look at the difference we have in forage NDF. So this is, you know, you hear people talk about 18, 20, 21% of forage NDF as typical forage NDF levels. We pushed it down to 11% forage NDF in this diet. So really getting down to those sort of levels that you may see in some other parts of the country as well. We were able to balance starch content of this diet as well, remember? Now remember, we reduced the fermentability of that starch by pulling out the high moisture corn coming in with the dry crown corn. And then crude protein was held pretty similar as well in these diets. Now total diet fatty acids went up. Now some of that's because there's more cottonseed in the diet, but also because we added that palmitic acid enriched fat supplement into this diet as well. And then with the supplemental methionine and lysine, we altered the proportion of methionine and lysine, probably more in line in this study, in this diet, with some of those levels that might be recommended if you were doing an amino acid balance type diet. So let's jump into the results here now. I've just got a few figures to show, and then hopefully that will open that up into some discussion. I think these results can raise some eyebrows and open up some good discussion here. First thing you will see here is kind of opposite to what we were thinking with lower forage NDF, and if we look at dry matter intake here. Let me just line up these figures just quickly. On our y-axis here is going to be our variable. Here's feed intake. The blue is the high forage or our control treatment, and then the green is the low forage treatment down here on the x-axis. Okay, so you can see straight away we had a big reduction in feed intake, dry matter intake, in these low forage cows, about 6 kilos less. If I was at the start of the study, I would have assumed that maybe those cows had eaten more. Now, we don't have the digestibility data back yet. Ariana was working on that, and just before the shutdown here on campus and everywhere else. So we're going to get to those as soon as we can. Even though we had that drop in intake, we held milk yield. There's no significant difference between these two groups of cows in milk yield. Again, these cows are all high producing cows, up around 100 pounds in milk. Now, if we look at milk fat, we can see there's no significant difference in milk fat content. Both groups of cows have good milk fat content, average about 395, just under a 40 butter fat. But with milk fat yield, we had a significant increase in milk fat yield, as one you might expect with the palmitic acid in there, the higher level of cottonseed. We had an increase in milk fat yield, despite that drop in intake, on our low forage treatment diet. Then if we look at protein content, now remember the protein in our control high forage diet was mostly driven by soybean meal, whereas in our low forage diet we have some blood meal in that pack and some supplemental methionine and lysine. We actually drove up, we increased milk protein content significantly, and we increased milk protein yield significantly. We were concerned about the protein yield side by pulling out so much of that fermentable corn, and that's one of the key reasons why we came in with some of the amino acid balancing in this study. Again, we increased milk fat yield, we increased milk protein yield as we went through on here. Now, because of those increases in fat and protein yield, as you would imagine, we actually got, as you can see, we actually got a nice increase, just under 2 kilos, so that nearly 5 pounds, 4.5, 5 pounds of energy corrected milk. So when we remember, no difference in fluid milk yield, but we increased fat and protein yield. That 1.9 kilo improvement in energy corrected milk. Now, of course, feed efficiency jumped up considerably in this study. Lower intake, increased energy corrected milk. You know, this is just that simple ratio of energy corrected milk over feed intake shown here. So a big jump up in feed efficiency in these mid-lactation cows here. So obviously with that drop in intake and the increase in fat yield, protein yield, body condition, body weight could have been a concern. In this study though, we saw no difference in overall body weight of these cows here. Actually, if we look at body weight change on kilos per day, we actually see there was a trend for it to be slightly higher in those low forage diets. Certainly no indication that these cows were losing body weight or mobilizing body weight to help support this milk production. These body weight change data, I think, is very solid in this type of study. We used the approach that Mike Vanderhaar and his colleagues developed a few years ago. As I said, we did body weights 3 times a week throughout that whole month, and then we can fit a regression line through there to get looking at changes in body weight. So it takes that into account quite nicely, and especially over a longer time period as well. And then with body condition score, again, no indication that these cows are losing body condition. In fact, there was actually a significant for a slight increase in body condition score in those low forage cows. So as I've said, we're really looking forward to getting that digestibility data back to look at energy and nutrient intake in these cows. Because clearly these data would suggest that nutrient digestibility increased significantly in that low forage diet as well. So there's just a summary of the data we saw. If anyone's interested in this, I can share this slide. We are hoping to present this at Dairy Science this summer. We'll have to see where we go with that. But just to summarize, the low forage diet that we designed to try and mimic if we were in a shortage of forage or we needed to stretch our forage inventories. These cows ate less. They gave more energy-corrected milk, same level of milk yield, and that energy-corrected milk was driven by more yield of fat and protein. And they maintained, and they certainly didn't lose any body weight or body condition. In fact, they gained some across this study. Now, I need to thank Nate Elsing about putting this economic data together in early March, I think end of February, early March, just to show this. And I'm just showing this purely as an example. Remember, this is going to be changing certainly now compared to what it was a month ago. As I said earlier on, the formulated diet cost was a lot more for that low forage diet because some of those additional additives we had in the diet. But remember, that's assuming that those cows ate the same. So the cost here was more on a formulated, and a cost per pound of dry matter is higher than the conventional diet here. But when you took into account the actual feed intakes we observed in this study, the cost of that diet per cow per day was lower. Obviously, their income was higher, about $1.60 a high here because that increased fat and protein yield. And then, there's our pounds of fat and protein here, 7.5 versus 7.2 here. So the income per hundredweight was increased, and then the income over feed costs per cow was higher, as was income over feed costs per hundredweight of milk was higher on that more expensive diet in this case. So really, again, a proof of concept that we can formulate these lower forage diets. We did everything we could with this low forage diet to ensure we certainly didn't lose milk production. In fact, we actually gained it. We came in with some of that additional palmitic acid, those supplemental amino acids, to allow us to try and maintain. And in fact, we actually went ahead and improved here. So to summarize, that low forage diet supplemented with amino acids and palmitic acid, decreased feed intake, increased yields of fat and protein, increased feed efficiency. Okay. So we can, here in Michigan, in the Midwest, feed these very low forage diets. Remember, we were down at just over 11% forage NDF. We came in with some supplemental amino acids and palmitic acid, and we actually increased the yield of fat and protein with lower feed intake. Didn't have any negative effect on body weight, milk yield, body weight change. So, we can potentially stretch these inventories in these times if we are concerned about forage quantity or forage quality. We can reduce less forage fed per cow, increase milk production. I realize where we are today may be different to last month on economics, especially with some of the byproduct feeds I hear that are increasing in cost with some of the shutdowns that we're seeing now as well. But hopefully a proof of concept to show you there what's possible. Again, Michigan Alliance for Animal Agriculture helps support this work along with VitaPlus through their generous continued support of the master student here, in this case, Ariana Negrera. So I need to thank Matt Wood, Stacey Nichols for that support there. Purdue Agribusiness gifted us the palmitic acid supplement. And then particularly I'd like to thank Stacey and Nate for helping formulate the diets here in this study, and then Faith Collins and all the Farm South MSU, and then John Gazer for sharing a couple of those introductory slides with me earlier on in continued discussion here. So there's my email address. If anyone wants a copy of some of this or wants to follow up with me, please do so. I'm going to pass it back to Barry. I have some questions now. We also have some questions after Barry's talk as well. So thanks, Barry.
Adam, excellent job. Thank you so much. Go ahead and encourage anybody who's on the live stream here to throw in a question in the chat if you have one. In the meantime, Adam, want to throw a question at you. So as you know, I've done some work in this space, and I'm just curious, I would say probably 90% of the time, if there's been a change in feed intake on these sort of lower forage diet strategies, typically it's an increase. And so to me, that was one of the more interesting responses you saw. Any ideas why that might have been the case here?
That's a jolly good question. I don't know exactly right now. You know, these were very high producing dairy cows. I don't know if that has any impact. Again, you would assume the lower forage NDF, they'd have more ability to consume more. I don't know if the higher fatty acid intake with the more cottonseed there in particular, maybe there was some more unsaturated fatty acids post-ruminally that maybe have impacted feed intake. Again, normally we think of that as a negative, but it certainly wasn't a negative in this study. Certainly no indication that they were mobilizing body weight to support that higher milk production. So other than the fatty acid side there, maybe some of those unsaturated, I don't have any biological reason to think about that now. It will be important to get the digestibility data back to to see what was the increase in energy intake these cows are getting. We know, for example, that we fed a more energy dense diet. We know, for example, the palmitic acid we supplemented that consistently across all of our study increases NDF digestibility. So we're probably getting improvements in NDF digestibility. I think more cottonseed in the diet probably improve fatty acid digestibility. So a number of things I think add up here that would allow us to improve nutrient digestibility across the board. And maybe we were, maybe that was enough. Clearly, that looks like that was enough to increase milk production beyond what they were doing on the control cows.
Fair enough. Okay, well, Adam, thanks so much.